This is part 2 of The Long Shadow, an interview with Bruce Perry. This begins at the bottom of page 8. Supin, can you explain a little more about how our stress response systems work? Perry, all input, feelings of hunger or thirst, loud noises, the sound of someone's voice, some information we learn, first enters the lower, more primitive part of our brains, which determines if this input is familiar or unfamiliar. If the input is familiar, it then travels to a higher, more evolved part of our brain, where we decide based on memory whether it's good, bad, or neutral. If the input is unfamiliar, the brain's default conclusion is, this can't be good. Any novelty, even desirable novelty, like learning something new, activates our stress response system. Some stress is actually good for us. For example, the stress related to meeting a new person, traveling to a new place. Predictable, controllable, and moderate activation of the stress response system has been shown to build our capacity to manage challenges. When a child has the opportunity to challenge herself in the presence of supportive adults, it builds resilience. It's the dose, the pattern, and the controllability that determine whether the stress is adaptive or harmful. Say you're a 6-year-old boy, and up until now your life has been okay. Mom and dad split up, and there was some conflict around the divorce, but nothing too horrible. Then all of a sudden, Mom has a new boyfriend in the house. That's novel, so it generates moderate stress. At dinner, he raises his voice at you. That's unpredictable. He soon starts barking orders at you more frequently. He yells at your mom. He hits you, or he hits your mom. Your stress response system doesn't have time to return to baseline before another source of stress arises. You start having anticipatory anxiety about what will happen next. Your baseline level of stress increases. Things that would not have bothered you much before now bother you a lot. A harsh tone of voice that may have been mildly upsetting is now overwhelming. The boyfriend's behavior continues, your stress response system may start to register any angry tone of voice as threatening. You've become what we call sensitized. Supin. Conventional wisdom might suggest that the boy would get used to the angry, violent behavior and be less affected by it over time. But you're saying the opposite is true. Perry. Exactly. The more our stress response system is activated in uncontrollable ways, the less able we are to handle even small amounts of stress. When you are overstressed, you no longer have efficient access to your higher brain functions. By the time you're in a state of alarm, significant parts of your cortex, the highest functioning part of your brain, have shut down entirely. This is adaptive if you're confronted by a predator because you don't want to waste time thinking about how to respond. You want to fight or run away. But to do your best reasoning, you need access to that sophisticated part of your brain. To learn and plan, you need to be in a relatively calm state. Supin, let's go back to the 6-year-old boy in your example. What happens to him at school? Perry, the brain is good at generalizing from one kind of experience to another. Most of the time, this ability is a gift, but this boy may generalize that all male authority figures who raise their voices are terrifying. This starts a vicious cycle. The boy arrives at school already on heightened alert due to his home situation, and he can't pay attention. The teacher gets frustrated and raises his voice. The child is now even more on red alert. It's impossible for him to concentrate. The rational parts of his brain shut down. Instead, he has access only to the parts that process information valuable in threatening situations. He's attuned to the teacher's tone of voice, to whom the teacher is smiling at. He's learning to read nonverbal cues. The calm child will learn the state capitals. The sensitized child will learn who is the teacher's pet. Supin. Can he recover from that? Perry. Yes. Opportunities for controlled, moderate doses of stress can shift these systems back toward well-regulated functioning. The key is that a moderate challenge for a typical child may be a huge challenge for a sensitized child. The achievement gap in schools has a lot to do with the child's home and community life. If the family is concerned about not having money for food or rent or a doctor's visit, that creates a pervasive sense of anxiety and unpredictability. The longer the child is in that environment, the worse the vicious cycle at school becomes. Eventually, the kid says to himself, "There's something wrong with me. I'm stupid." And he drops out as soon as he can. Supin. What about the character building benefits of facing down adversity, of rising to the challenge? Is that ever applicable in these situations? Perry. You start from a healthy place, adversity can be character building. But if you grow up amid constant adversity, you are less likely to have the flexible and capable stress response systems you need to face down adversity. Certainly, many children do grow up with remarkable gifts and strengths despite their challenges. When this happens, it's often because there were people in the child's environment who helped create a safe, predictable space for the child, at least part of the time. Supin. Are there instances in which well-intentioned parents protect their children from stress too much? Perry. Yes, I've seen upper-middle-class children develop anxiety disorders because they had never been given the opportunity to explore the world. They've been told only, don't do this, don't do that, don't get dirty. By the time these children went to preschool, they hadn't learned to tolerate even slight discomforts. They became overwhelmed by the novelty of preschool and had meltdowns. Resilience comes from stress. It's important that parents, teachers, and coaches not be afraid of it. Exploring, getting dirty, and falling down help you build resilience and tolerate novelty and discomfort. Supin. How might we apply this to whole communities? Perry. First, we have to understand that feeling connected to other people is one of our most fundamental needs. We feel safer when we're with kind and familiar people. Tension can arise from being part of a marginalized minority, whether you define that minority status by economics, race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual preference, or whatever. The marginalized group has a much higher level of baseline stress. It's not a specific traumatic event. It's a continuous sense of disconnection. Our brain is constantly monitoring our environment to gauge whether or not we belong someplace. If we frequently get feedback that we don't belong, or worse, overt threats, then our body's systems stay in a constant state of arousal. This increases the risk for diabetes and hypertension and makes learning, reflection, planning, and creative problem solving harder. For time, it will actually change the physiology of your brain. For example, someone who already feels marginalized and is hypervigilant, even a relatively benign interaction, such as a police officer asking for your license, can trigger a volatile reaction. This is true for both the person being stopped and for the cop who's doing the stopping. They both can be sensitized. People in law enforcement should know the principles of stress and trauma. It's the key to understanding why some of their policies and behaviors have a destructive effect. Supin. Are you aware of any programs to train law enforcement personnel in these principles? Perry. I did some work with the FBI after the Branch Davidian standoff in Waco, Texas. In 1993, the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, and the Texas National Guard held the Branch Davidian religious group under siege for 51 days, culminating in an explosive clash and 86 deaths. Editor. Supin, what were you doing, and what did you learn? Perry. The events at Waco were astoundingly tragic. We brought in a team of people to help with the Branch Davidian children both during and after the standoff. Branch Davidians were a highly insular fundamentalist religious group who had sworn absolute allegiance to their charismatic and controlling leader, David Koresh. The group certainly conformed to all academic definitions of a cult. In the first 3 days of the standoff, 21 children were released into the care of the FBI and the Texas Child Protective Services. I got involved because I lived nearby, and someone in the Texas government asked for my assistance. I went to Waco figuring I'd make some recommendations and be back home in a few days. I ended up assembling a team and staying for months. When I first arrived, I was greeted by an imposing Texas Ranger who was feeling understandably protective of these children and none too keen about a psychiatrist messing with their heads. In trauma work, we routinely track heart rates because even when traumatized children express no outward stress response, their heart rates are often elevated. I offered the ranger a deal. He could take the pulse of a girl sleeping soundly nearby, and if it was below 100, I'd leave. The normal resting heart rate for a child her age is about 80 beats per minute. Her pulse was 160. I stayed, and the ranger and I became close collaborators in helping these kids. Others wanted to get the kids therapy, but I said no. First, let's bring them consistency and predictability. Let's minimize the number of new adults in their lives. Let's settle them into a routine and allow them to build some familiarity with us. About 7 weeks passed from the time the 21 children were released until the bloody conclusion of the standoff. I interviewed each child multiple times during that period, but was also just with them, day in and day out. So I got to know them. Each evening, after the kids had gone to bed, the adults would sit together and talk about what we'd seen during the day. We found that each child had about 3 hours of therapeutic interaction a day, even though none of them received formal therapy. Throughout the day, kids would seek out small doses of support. One child might go up to the best adult hugger and get a hug. Later, that same child might find the funniest adult and get a laugh. The key here is that the children control the nature and duration of the interaction. Their heart rates began to go down. We had a diverse enough group that the children could find exactly what they needed at any particular moment. It reminded me of traditional multi-generational clans, where maybe mom is good at fixing a hurt, and grandpa is good at storytelling, and someone else can start a fire, and so on. The community offers a rich array of people to learn and receive support from. Living with those 21 Branch Davidian children changed how I thought about therapeutic work. We offered structure, familiarity, caring, and no therapy. A 50-minute therapy session might be a part of treating trauma. Ideally, it's simply one thread in a much larger web of therapeutic encounters. My confidence in our approach grew when the Davidians' attorney insisted that the children be allowed to visit their parents. During those visits, the parents repeated Koresh's apocalyptic message, warning that we were going to kill them all. And sure enough, after the visits, the kids' heart rates shot back up. As soon as the visits stopped, the children returned to baseline. Over the years, my colleagues and I have honed our ability to identify and educate the adults in a child's family, community, and school who might help provide therapeutic experiences. We teach them about the impact that trauma and adversity have had on a child's functioning. We give them realistic expectations. The most at-risk children are often disconnected from family, school, and community. Reestablishing those connections appears to buffer the effects of trauma. Distributing caregiving duties among a set of healthy and loving adults is one of the best ways to help isolated, overwhelmed, and incompetent parents, grandparents, parents, and friends, and all shoulder some of the burden. Supin. What can communities do to support and encourage healthy development? Perry. A number of years ago, Chicago's Cabrini Green Public Housing added some green space among the high-rise apartment buildings. They put in a better playground. They put in benches where people could sit. No other changes were made or new services offered, but over the next couple of years, violent crime in that housing project dropped by 30%. Your living environment increases the probability that you will interact with your neighbor. It makes both of you physically healthier, socially healthier, and less likely to suffer the mental health issues associated with being isolated and marginalized. Another set of studies were done of indigenous populations in British Columbia that had suffered the long-term consequences of cultural genocide. Authorities suppressing languages, religious practices, economic systems, all the things that create a cohesive community. Throughout British Columbia, dozens of these indigenous communities have recovered their languages, traditional practices, and so forth. And those same communities have experienced decreases in violent crime, alcoholism, and suicide. In some, the suicide rates dropped to the same as the general population, which is astounding for an indigenous population. Supin, how do you know if something traumatic happened with a child? Will he or she express it behaviorally? Harry, frequently yes, but it's amazing how many times kids will also make an initial disclosure. They'll say, I don't like to go to Grandpa's house. If that gets no response, they might come back later and say, Grandpa likes to play games. But if, when a kid makes that comment, the adult says, Grandpa loves you, don't talk bad about Grandpa, the kid won't bring it up again. The child was testing the waters to see how open you are to hearing something negative about Grandpa. The moment the child senses that you're not open, he or she backs away.